Hello and welcome to Waylander's Wandering, where today we're going to be painting General Obi Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars Legion The Clone Wars starter set. As you can see, I've already given him a quick undercoat, for which I started off with standard grey from the Colour Forge, and then went over with a zenithal highlight of grey sear from Citadel colour, both of which, as you can see, are rattle cans. Okay, and now that out of the way, I think what we're going to start with is his undersuit, which will be pretty much just his trousers here, I think, and maybe the gaps in between the armour plates. And to get this, what we're going to do is take our favourite black contrast paint from Citadel colour and give it a quick bash over with Black Legion straight from the pot. So let's get on with that without further ado. Being careful, or being slightly careful not to get any on any other areas. What will come in first with into the trouser area on the General Kenobi, which again is another phrase I never thought I'd have to use. Here I am, grown man, talking about sticking it up Obi Wan Kenobi's trouser area. Still, new year, new me. So we're being very careful in here, getting the paint just where we want it and trying not to get anywhere where we don't, but as always at this stage of the game it kind of doesn't really matter. We are going to be painting all these other areas anyway, so a little misstep here and there isn't going to make a massive amount of difference. Oh, by the way, I hope you've noticed the new camera angle from above, where I'm hoping that my habit of moving around a lot while I paint isn't going to take my work off screen too often as it did in the past. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. So after hitting all of these areas, what I'm going to do now is go around, do the rest of these little black areas, and I'll bring you guys back in when that's done. With the black completed on the undersuit that you can see here beneath these robes, the trousers, some little bits on the arms and around the underarm there. I also decided to do his gloves with the black, the lightsaber hilt, and some very fine panel lining between the armor panels on his shins, knees, and forearms and shoulders, and the back of his hand there. So now all those bits are on and drying, it is time to tackle the leather parts, which I'm going to use Gorgrunter Fur from Citadel colour. This is another contrast paint to make life a little bit easier for ourselves. And I'm simply going to go over his actual boots that you can see here sticking out below the armour, and his belt. I will do an all-over coat on his belt and then pick out some bits later with a metallic and maybe a bit of black. We'll see. So again, straight from the pot, we take the Gorgrunter Fur and just kind of splash it on. And as usual, I realise I didn't say this before for the black, but as usual with contrast paint, we put it on, we will work it around the miniature at a reasonable clip, but not so fast that we start making mistakes, because whilst this stuff is kind of like magic when it goes on, what we don't want is it to start drying and to tear that set surface, because, well, honestly, it will be virtually impossible to fix without starting again from scratch, and nobody wants to do that. You can put it on quite heavily, But as usual, if it does start to pool in any areas where you don't want it to, quickly rinse your brush off and use your now clean brush to wick up any of those areas. So that's his boots done. I'll move on to the belt. And I will just go over everything because I'm not sure whether we're going to do the black parts at all. So come in like so, remembering that it can go on heavily, but not so heavily that it floods everywhere. And there we have it. All those little brown areas done, along with the black, so we're cracking along quite nicely and relatively quickly with this. So because I want these paints to have plenty of time to cure, I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee, and I'll bring you guys back in when we start the next stage. Talking about coffees, if you want to scan the QR code in the top left of your screen, you can buy me a coffee and support me in my work, or click the link down in the description below to do likewise. So I'll be back with you in what will be mere seconds for you and 20 minutes to half an hour for me. Now that those black and brown coats have had time to cure, it's time to start on the actual armour pieces on the shins, knees, arms and shoulders, and this piece over his shoulders and onto the top of his chest on Obi-Wan, for which I will be starting off with an off-white, which is pallid witch flesh from Citadel colour, which I'm going to put onto my wet palette here and get a few blobs on there just to keep it running while we work with it. A touch of water just to thin it down a little, and the brush back to a point. Quick rinse. There you go, because we don't want the brush overloaded. Get a little bit onto our brush, bring it back to a point, and carefully, not hitting the underarm areas or those bits that we've already blacked in, we will start blocking in all of these armour panels with the off-white. Now this wants to be a nice even coat, so it'll probably need a second going over after it's had a few minutes to dry. But being very careful, coming through. We'll hit all of these areas. So me and my shaky hand will try and get through all of this without foofing it up too badly, and again, if we do, we can always just go over it with the Black Legion to touch it up again. And I will do this and bring you guys back in once it's got a nice even coat and there's a time to cure. Now that we have a nice even coat of the pallid witch flesh over all those armour areas, and I've touched up the black and brown where I went a little bit over, it's time to do a little bit of shade work on that same white armor area. To achieve this, the first thing we're going to do is go over it with Citadel Color Contrast Apothecary White, which, as you can still see from the many times I've used it, isn't white at all, it is actually grey. But again, as it's contrast paint, we'll use it straight from the pot, and being careful not to get it on the places again we don't want it, we will go over all the armor areas, paying particular attention to get at least a little into all the recesses. And because this is grey, and it's well, anywhere that it touches is pretty much going to be grey or black as well, we're not going to worry too much about making any mess. So without letting it pool, because too much pooling is bad, we will get the apothecary grey over all these areas quite heavily, but you know, not too heavily. That's a bit much. Let's put some of that back up. There we go. And as you can see, that we have some in all the recesses. It's adding a little bit of depth and shade to this pallid witch flesh off-white colour, and that should give us our sort of dark tone into any of these armor areas. So I'll carry on with this and give you guys a shout when it's all dry. Now that that apothecary white has had time to dry and has settled into the deeper recesses, as you can see here, particularly across this upper back piece, it's time to begin to relayer the white and bring it back up to a nice, relatively crisp colour. To achieve this, the first thing we're going to do is relayer it with a quite thin coat of Corex white, which is not a true white but an off-white, and then a highlight along the edges with Citadel Colour White Scar, which is an actual true white. So let's get on with this. We will first put a little bit of the Corex white onto our wet palette. Glob on. There we go. Russian old tinkle, and using a little drop of that water, we will just thin it down slightly. Nice working consistency. Now that's about right to me. So we'll now come in and going over this white area, trying to stay away from the deeper recesses. We will go over the entire white areas again, and well, load it back up as I said. Starting with this new pad, which I will go through with you. We'll keep away from the deeper areas that are holding shade, and just layering this Corex white onto the flat upper areas. Again, we come around the side of the shin pad, staying away from the deep shaded area. Same at the bottom, away from the deep shaded area. And just along the white, nice and smooth with the rest of the shin pad. When we come to the back of the shin pad, as you can see here, what we'll do is we will put some in the middle there, this deep part, draw it down to the bottom, and then coming from the side, just run up to that lip with the edge of our brush. This leaves a nice little shadow. As you can see here. I'll carry on with that for the rest of the miniature. Bring you back in when it's time to put the white scar highlight on. Right then, now that we've finished with the Corex white, you could actually leave the armor pieces at that stage if you chose. But what I'm going to attempt is a technique that honestly I'm not that keen on, which is an edge highlight using white scar, which I will also use to stick a nice base layer on the lightsaber blade to give me something to work off for that later. Okay, Games Workshop white paints are famously kind of claggy and a little bit thick, so we will again be putting a scooch of this onto our wet palette and adding a tiniest drop of water. Just thin it down a little, should do. And I will then come in with a not too loaded brush, and just using the very edge of the brush, skim down some of these raised edges, just to pick them out and give them just that little je ne sais quoi, as our French brethren say. Again, where possible, use the edge of your brush, barely touching the miniature. Come down along the upper edges. So down the front of there and there. For edges like this, we can't get in the side of your brush, just very gently, a straight line, trying to move the miniature rather than the brush too much. We won't get in with our little edge highlights again with edges like this on the back of the leg. We want to come a little around the top and down the side of there. We angle the miniature so that we will be doing a straight up and down stroke where we can. Just that way, get a little more control. I'll quickly demonstrate that again on the back armour. So, see, say there. Try and get the miniature as up and down as we can, and just on the edge of the brush. It's possible. Important thing being that you're comfortable in the angle you're holding the brush at and the angle you're painting at, because of course the miniature can go upside down like this, and you come in, just touch that edge highlight. So I'll carry on with the rest of these and bring you in before we start painting Obi Wan's tunic. Now that we've got all that edge highlighting done, which is a quite subtle effect, as I think you can see from this, it's time to do Obi Wan's robe here, and the tabard part around the back, of course, here and here. And for that, if I recall correctly, Obi Wan tended to wear a kind of sandy pale robe, so we'll start off with the base coat of Citadel colour Xandri Dust, which again I will thin a little on my wet palette, and then I'll bring you back in as soon as that's done. So because we're now on to stages where we have already got complete bits, such as the black, brown and white, it's time to start being a touch more careful with where the paint's going. And with that in mind, I mean, if you do make a mistake, you can still go back and fix it, don't get me wrong, but well, if you're careful, You don't have to go back and fix it. Hopefully, he says, with everything crossed. So we'll start here on the tabard part. Nice even coat, and looking at how this initial coat is going on, we are definitely going to need a minimum of 2 thin coats of paint, because of course, as I say in every one of these tutorial type videos, 2 thin coats retaining the detail on the miniature is always going to be better than one big fat blobby coat that covers everything up. So I will carry on with this and bring you back in when it's time to add a shade layer. Now that coat of Xandri dust has had plenty of time to dry and cure, what we're going to do is go over the robes and tabard again, but this time using a sepia shade from Vallejo Game Wash, which, looking at my palette here, you can see is a nice rich brown on the warmer end of those tones, which should contrast quite nicely with the cool white of the armour. So using a slightly larger brush, what we're going to do is go over all of these areas, making sure that all the shade, all the recesses catch some of the wash, whilst trying not to let it pour too much on the high areas. As you can see, we get a nice deep bit in there and here, and we make sure that it doesn't pour on the tops. So I will quickly whip around the miniature with this wash. It shouldn't take long, will take maybe 45 minutes to dry properly, at which point, while that's drying, I'll have lunch and you will see a dissolve cut when I bring you back in. Now that the sepia wash has had adequate time to dry, it is time to highlight back up the robe to bring back that paler sand colour. To achieve this, the first thing we're going to do is wet the brush in some clean water and then get most of the liquid off, and be a little drier on the tissue, so that when run across your hand it leaves the bristles, well, it leaves your skin cool but not wet. Now we will take some of this Xandri dust, put it on our texture palette and work it into the bristles and try and get the majority of the Xandri dust off. Just on the back of the hand again, it's a little bit heavy, so a little again, and that is what we want. So being careful not to hit any other areas, what we're going to do is lightly run across all the areas on the robe, so you can get a better view, like so. Going across the grain, as it were, where possible, and not where it isn't. I feel that this gives the best kind of cloth texture you can hope for on a miniature without spending, well, an absolute age on it. So moving across, a little bit more on where you need to, again working so it's not flooding the brush, and come across and go this piece here on the body. Being careful not to get any on. Doesn't matter, by the way, if you do get some on his belt here, because that will only serve to add a highlight layer to that as well, where the darker brown underneath will still show through. And of course, having the highlights, the two sections and two colours matching will only help to tie the overall colour scheme of the model together and give us a much nicer finish. Down onto the sort of edge of the skirt of the robe there. Quickly go again, around, trying to add a kind of a slight edge highlight where we can. And there we go. First stage of the highlighting of the robe, which has also highlighted his belt, complete. The next stage we will come through and we'll perform a similar task without cleaning our brush, of course, with Citadel colour Ushabti bone. But what we will do with this, we will try and get a highlight that is even finer and less defined. And just touching kind of the real upper area, so we're just holding the brush quite high up the brush itself and away from the ferrule, so that we're getting a much softer hit of the bristles against the miniature, trying to just hit the robe this time and not belt or any other areas again, and rubbing across very gently. That is a nice highlight. I mean, you could go a few stages further, adding some white to the Ushabti bone and bring it up a couple of levels, and maybe even add a pure white edge highlight to some of the areas, but quite honestly, I think that looks just fine. Okay, so moving on to the skin, we're going to start with, on the face and ears, with a couple of thin coats of Cadian flesh tone from Citadel Colour. So we'll put a blob on the old wet palette. A touch of water just to thin it down for use. Seems to be a nice consistency. And now, being relatively careful that we don't hit anything else, we will go in and up to the hairline, maybe over the hair slightly, because that's going to get covered itself later. We will come in and hit all of those skin areas, remembering of course that Obi Wan Kenobi has a beard. He's ending up with a miniature with a flesh coloured beard. Maybe a bit weird. A weird beard, if you will. So again, coming up to the hairline, other side. There we go. Around his beak. Nicely in there. Lift some off where it's a little bit heavier around the eye. Seems to be. There we go. Around to the other side. His other tab. Not forgetting to come in, because these are quite a soft plastic, you can get your thumb, lift up the lightsaber and come in around the mouth, just so there's some colour in there. So we'll let this dry, see if it needs another thin coat. So I'll give it another thin coat and I'll bring you back when it's time to do the shading. After giving that flesh tone a moment or two to cure, it's time to hit it now with Waylander Flesh Shade from Citadel Colour, straight from the pot. Again, trying to just hit the skin areas and nothing else, although we can, as before, run into the hair somewhat. Because this particular miniature is kind of squinty and his eyes are difficult to see, what we're going to do is try and get them as dark as possible so that you get the suggestion of an eye without actually having to try and get a brush in there and paint them, which would be a faff to say the very least. Okay, remember to do the back of your neck, and don't forget, boys and girls, when washing, always hit the back of your neck. And don't forget to get into the mouth area again to give a suggestion of some lips in there. Now this will need a little longer than the underlying flesh tone to cure, because this is more of an ink than a paint, and as I'm sure we're all aware, acrylics dry famously quickly. So I will give this 45 minutes to an hour to cure. I think I'll watch a YouTube video or something while I wait, and I will bring you back in after this dissolve cut. Now that that wash has had perfect amount of time to dry, what we're going to do now is go over the skin again, this time with the Cadian flesh tone again, but just hitting the higher areas such as the bridge of the nose, like so, the forehead, but leaving a small gap between the forehead and the hairline now, around the eye sockets there, and then coming in onto the cheekbones and cheeks so that we get a highlight, but we leave a line of shade between the highlights and the shady areas. So I'll finish this and bring you in again momentarily. Okay, now that that Cadian flesh tone highlight has had time to go off, we'll come in with a little Kislev flesh from Citadel Colour, again on the wet palette, and with just the barest hint of water, just to thin it down slightly. We're going to come in this time hitting the very most highlight areas, so the very kind of tip of the nose area there, the very edge of the cheekbone, a little on the brow. Don't want to get too much on there. Moving across, and do the other cheekbone. Now the other cheekbone can have a little more on it because this is the side where the lightsaber is, and the lightsaber will become a light source of its own when we paint it, giving a little more light on that side than the other. So there we have the flesh tones done. Oh, mustn't forget his lower lip. There we go, let's get in. There we go, a little bit on the lower lip. And we'll come in again It's time to do the hair. Now all the skin's complete, it's time to finish off Obi-Wan by painting in his hair and beard. For this I'm going to use Mornfang Brown from Citadel for the lower parts of his hair and his beard, and then attempt to wet blend, which is a technique I'm not very confident with, on the sort of the top of his head. So let's see how this goes, guys. This could be an adventure for us both, because it's not really something I'm confident with. But anyway, onwards and upwards. We will put some Mornfang Brown, don't need a lot, on our palette, and give it a dab of water to thin it down. And because we're going to be working with it almost straight away, we've also had a little of the Baylor Brown right next to it, and also add a touch of water to that. A little more paint. Seems to be a little bit runny. I think my wet palette maybe is a little wet, strangely enough. So here we go. Wish me luck. We'll come in first and relatively quickly sort of around the head, avoiding the skin and the ears with the Mornfang Brown. So I understand it. It's better to do the darker colours first. If you disagree, feel free to leave a comment down below. But before you do comment, let's wait and see how it all looks. So before this has time to really dry, we'll now come in with the Baylor Brown across the top of the head. And going as quick as we can, lickety split up the ziggurat. We will get this in as well. Hinting towards the Baylor Brown. Okay, now with a wet brush, we will try and come in as quickly as we can and tease those colours together and see what sort of mess we can make. But honestly, all it looks like I'm doing here is taking the Baylor Brown off. Put a little bit more over there, a bit there, and that's his head of hair, kinda done and kinda blended into each other. Now it does have a little forelock bit there. We will very gently tease it in, maybe even give him an eyebrow. And everybody looks a bit weird with just one eyebrow, so we do another one. And now, using just the Mornfang Brown, we will come in and do his beard. So I really don't fancy doing all of this, cutting in and faffing about on an area so difficult to get out with a rush. There we go. I think that will have to serve. Just to get some of this thing down, we'll see if we can do something a little more interesting with this blending on his head. Just gently touching it in so that it can run into the crevices, into its little parting bit there, into the crevices there on top. There we go. I think we'll leave that to dry for a while, and if it looks kind of okay, the next stage will be painting the lightsaber, and if it doesn't look the next stage will be a grown man crying. So I hope you're looking forward to that. This has had time to dry. I have to say, while it's not going to win any painting competitions anywhere, I'm kind of happy with it, and definitely from the front it looks fine. Carry on around the sides, it looks pretty good still, and from this side still looks pretty good, and even from the back it looks okay. Yeah, I don't think he's going to have to wear a paper bag on his head on the battlefield for this job. So let's move on to the lightsaber. Now, for those of you who watched my painted General Grievous video, you will already know how I do this, but for those who didn't, let's start with a Calgar Blue layer paint from Games Workshop. Splodge a good bit on our wet palette, get it to a, if not a glaze consistency, a very thin layer. Let's have a look at this. So we want it thin enough to, yeah, I think that'll do. And now we'll start with the lightsaber, and again we're going to do as if the brightest part is at the hilt, moving darker through the saber itself. So glaze this on, painting from hilt to tip, because when you're doing these brush strokes, the most pigment will always be left at the end of the brush stroke. So in this case, just the tip. Adam. So we'll get this on, allow it to dry. It's quite wet and watery, so it's going to take a little bit of time to dry. And then the next layer we will start a little bit further up the hilt and move to the tip, and a little bit further up the hilt and move to the tip, and bloody blah, bosh, 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 until we're getting pretty much just pure paint at the end, which should leave us a nice even distribution from the base of the blade to the tip, and give us a fairly natural looking lightsaber, or at least as natural looking as you can with a laser sword. So I will do this glazing because it's going to take a fair old bit of time. I'll bring you chaps and chapettes in when we're happy with it. So I'll bring you guys back in when it's basing time. Right, so there's the lightsaber blade complete, and as you can see, I've added a little of the blue glaze to the chest armor, gloves, and his cheek to represent the light source, glowing onto those areas. This technique is known as OSL, or object source lighting, and I think looks pretty good. So the only thing left to do is complete the base, which I will be painting to match the clone troopers I showed in a previous video. And since I showed it in a previous video, what we're going to do is a coat of Doom Ball Brown on top of the base so that that white doesn't show through. Then Martian Iron Earth quite heavily, which will crack and crackle and leave a sort of a dried riverbed deserty effect. On top of that, Agarax Earthshade to emphasize those cracks a little more, to darken them down. A final dry brush on top of all of that with Xandri Dust, and to edge the base completely, just to tidy everything off and make it look neat and tidy, with Abaddon Black. And since you've seen me base things so many times before, I will not force you to watch this again. I will just bring you back in for a final look at the miniature. So there we have it, the end of this overlong video and my take on General Obi Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars Legion Clone Wars starter set. I hope that you found at least a couple of these techniques useful, and I'm very happy that you've stayed to the end. As always, I've been Waylander, you've been fantastic. I love your faces, and goodbye.